Robert,
Jeannie.
Kelly, it is so divine to be here in your studio and beautiful home. I've been here many times or quite a few times before, and it's always such a pleasure to see your beautiful work and to see your studio and how you live and how committed you are to your practice. I also want to say thank you for being a part of Savage Wonder. It means a lot to us.
Oh,
And so thank you for being in Kaleidoscape, and we hope you'll be in many more shows to come. I wanted to start with that, but I also want to talk to you about your artistic practice. And one of the things I've noticed, and I would love to hear what you have to say, is so much of the work has an emphasis on the surface. So you've got pentimento, pentimenti, you've got collage, you've got kind of words and images obscured. And I'm curious if you could talk about that and talk about collage and talk about what surface means to you.
hmm. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be included in your enterprise, Christopher's enterprise, and a joy to be affiliated with the larger world through your enterprise, as opposed to being in my cave. Um, I think the answer I would give now, but it's pertinent to what I was doing then, which is really breaking the autonomy of the white space, the blank space, and beginning a painting mid-narrative. And how to do that would be using, in my case, a lot of found papers, or in the earliest case, I started surfacing my work with Nepalese rice paper. So that would initiate a dialogue right away, and I would enter into that dialogue um, because of the material that I surfaced my canvases with. Now I surface a lot of my canvases um, with exotic papers, with vintage papers that have a certain amount of history to them, with text, with type. Um, so there is sort of a indwelling phantom. Back then, I think I used with the Nepalese rice paper. I toned it. I used a lot of burnt and raw sienna pigments. And so it brought in sort of the gold or the hues that you would find in early Renaissance painting, say in sienna. I then would paint it out, but you would still have that pentimenti, that taste of the warmth of, or the inner light of the canvas.
Nice.
Come forward 40 years, I realized that the surface itself was very much the content of my work. And so instead of painting it out, I realized that it possibly could be the most interesting part of the piece. Um, so I guess the other answer I could give, that technically I can do much more um, with paint on the collage surface than on the textured surface of a canvas. So process wise, it's allowed me to push and pull pigment in a very different way. It's allowed me to distill forms in a very different way, to create almost, well, to create somewhat of an objectivity rather than a subjective expression, where the form itself um, distills its own autonomy as opposed to being something that I painted.
Mhm.
So some of that has to do with what I can do on a collage surface than what I would be able to do on a canvas, a raw canvas surface.
So it's very interesting because the collage part is almost, I mean, it's so meticulous how you apply. And I find surfacing, your word is surfacing, very intriguing here. It's almost imperceptible. Um, but a couple of things you said. earlier in this conversation made me think of a couple of things. One, you were talking about your use of Nepalese rice paper. And I've noticed for a while, your subjects, if you will, um, or your titles are often sacred and devotional. And I wonder, is that something that goes decades back? Is that something relatively new? And what is the origin of that? Where does that come from?
Well, both of those are good questions or points of interest for me. I think the most important aspect of the collage work and how it's evolved, where I feel it's really high craft for me now because I've done it for so many years, is as it creates a substructure
Mm.
to all my present work. So there is a certain degree of exactitude.
Mhm.
And exactitude is a weird word to use because wet paper is anything but exact or exacting. But because I've done it for so long, not only am I trying to sabotage the white whale, as it were, of the blank canvas with a surface that's been around for a while or has a narrative, as I said. I do it in such a way um, that it creates this substructure that I naturally would have to answer to when I begin my painting. It is a scaffolding of some sort. It is the subtext. It is um, it also is an intuitive, it's become an intuitive process to me because when I'm collaging, I'm doing it flat. And I do grid the canvas very much like one might, going back to Renaissance gridding to get perspective, etc. But I want to create a complete orthogonal or exact right angle um, absolutism throughout it. And with cut paper, I, in this case, you can't compose the whole thing in advance, if at all. Uh, Even in preconceptual ways, it's done when I'm doing it. So the intuitional takes over, and I really do feel the intuitional or intuition in and of itself is sort of the Godhead, the highest part of who we become in terms of following a path. Um, so there's so much to talk about regarding collage. It's imperceptibility or imperceptiveness. You just have to get closer because my paintings need to be viewed as much as they need to be felt from afar. Perhaps they need to be viewed up close because the craft. I would like to say this: the craft is it's they're finely crafted,
Mhm.
and so and yet are so structurally important to the whole resolution of the composition that even in their negative space that they may define, they have a very positive and potent presence.
When you say they, are you talking specifically about the collage?
The
I
collage,
got you.
yeah.
Okay.
What is the exposed part of the painting?
Mhm.
So, and I could go on and on about that, but I also
Sure.
I like your second question. I mean, the quick answer to the second question is having grown up in New Mexico,
Mhm.
where the sacred, lowercase and uppercase, if you will, is all over the place there. One, you have the history of the Native Americans.
Mhm.
Two, you have the next layer, which is the Spanish having chosen Santa Fe as the capital in the New World. King Philip II designed Santa Fe as a colonial outpost. Um, and with both of those, with the Native Americans and their pueblos, not reservations, but the pueblos that surround Santa Fe, I don't know, 13 of them, are structures that have been there really since arguably anywhere between the classic period of 8 to 1200 AD. Then you have the Spanish coming. Then you have the the missionaries of the Franciscans, the Dominicans, etc. So you have a lot of churches too. And then you had the Pueblo Revolt 350 years ago, and blah, blah, blah. Chaos. But nonetheless, the effect of growing up there is the sacred is everywhere. The landscape, being a very old geological landscape, feels sacred. It's a wide open ocean. It is expansive. It gives oneself a sense of humility because it is so grand and vast, unknowing. So that relationship plays out basically with being humbled by the awness of the landscape there. And then the sacred's just everywhere. I mean, the churches are beautiful. Of course, Rancho House, painted by Georgia O'Keeffe. You can't say anything more. It's made of mud, and so it's anthropomorphic, and yet it has, obviously a sacred function, being a church, being a sanctuary, not getting into the political argument about what all of that can be. But same with the Native American, the Pueblos, going into the kivas, as where they're built into the earth. Ladders come out during the dances that we as kids or children would go visit midnight. You'd go to midnight mass, and then you'd go to the Pueblos to watch the dances. And so it just was a spectacular place to grow up. Yeah. Trying to bring this into something simple now, the sacred.
Well, can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I don't want to take you out of your thought process, but for example, the piece we have at Savage Wonder now up in Beacon, one of the 4 pieces, Lakshmi Anda. Now, that, if I'm not mistaken, is a Nepalese goddess. So it doesn't really come from Santa Fe per se. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit too. Since you did talk about, is it Hindu or Nepal? Tell us about Lakshmi Anda. Beautiful painting. So delighted to have it in our show. Thrilled.
Well, in this case, I'm riding on the coattails of my twin brother.
Okay. How's that?
We're not identical. He moved to Nepal in 1978 to be in the Peace Corps, and he spent 40 years there.
Oh gosh.
And so whatever I know a lot less than Thomas knows. So it's really his voice that should be doing the talking here, especially when it has to do with Nepalese or Hindu
now?
iconography.
I'm just curious. Where does he live now?
Thomas, right now he's in Mongolia leading a group on horseback.
He sounds cool. Okay, I didn't mean to get off subject.
Yeah.
But it's Indian.
So Lakshmi is interesting. I mean, I have visited him a lot, and Kathmandu throughout the years was such an exciting place to go to. For all the reasons given, the great landscape and as well as old civilization. Goes back to the definition of the sacred too. The architecture in New Mexico, the earth, old wood, places of reverence. Once again, going to Nepal in this case, it felt very, very similar. Both on from a Buddhist point of view, and from the very strange and exotic and much that I don't know point of view of Hinduism.
Are you a Buddhist?
I could never say I'm a Buddhist. I like the precepts of Buddhism.
Who doesn't?
And whatever attempt I may make to follow the paths of love and compassion and inner peace. However, getting back to Lakshmi, Lakshmi was that title. For one, onda means wave in Spanish, and in that painting, you notice there is some undulations that really is. Those are the waves, the onda. In this case, the lily pad that Lakshmi resides on.
Now, who's Lakshmi
She's the goddess of love, abundance, beauty, and her home usually is on a lily pad.
I see.
And so the onda in itself sort of represents the lily pad, or in Nepali they would call the Padma. Omani Padma Om means hail the jewel of the lotus. It's the lotus.
Oh, very beautiful.
So Lakshmi sits as the goddess on the lotus. And so, but in that painting, that form, for those of you that will see it, it looks just almost like a Grandma Moses form too, because it has sort of a what could be well, it has to be sort of anthropomorphized into being a head and an elegant torso that is really more like a Fibonacci geometric shape to some degree of negative and positive space. But I found that Lakshmi and the aspiration towards beauty, abundance, prosperity, and let's just say peace on a lotus blossom, I thought it was an endearing title.
It's a beautiful title. It really is, and it's a beautiful painting. Before we get into one of the other paintings we're showing, I'd like you to talk about this painting, but before we do, I want to talk about one more thing, and that is going back a little bit to your surfacing. And if I'm not mistaken, once upon a time, I saw here at your studio the most incredible painting, or several paintings that had movie posters in the background. So you talk about using rice papers, you talk about using different papers. How did the movie posters come about? When did you start doing that? And are you still doing that? And why is that important to you?
All fun questions, and fun to answer. I used to use a lot of memorabilia that I would find in my travels. I even had Buddhist monks up near Mount Everest in a place called Namche Bazaar that my brother and I went to. And I found the endless knot, really, which is a Tibetan solar sign, but it's almost like a swastika with the four directions. And they had wallpapered their monastery with this, and I loved it so much. I asked them, could I commission you to use these big wood blocks on the rice paper to create the endless knot? So that too became a part of it. But I think I'm going to go back to one of the things that has stuck with me before I even go to the movie posters, which was one of the earliest reviews of my work, which still stands with me, was this notion of buried history, the seepage of the distant voice, the storytelling, the idea that we come into this world with a sense of a prior knowledge. I love all of that applying to my paintings. And I mentored visually for a while off of Per Kirkeby, who's a Danish painter. And what I loved about his story was he was a geologist, and he spent a lot of time as a geologist on glaciers. And inevitably, what his paintings were about the landscape underneath the glacier, the buried history quality there. And he would do layers and layers of paintings, and it would all be about that buried history. And in that history would be tracings, etc., that would give a clue, a hint as to where to enter the painting. That being said, I do love in found papers the pentimenti, the palimpsest, the mark making, which I used to do myself quite a bit, little graffiti marks, etc. But I felt I was being disingenuous. I think what's happened is now I feel I need to have the paper be unblemished somehow of how I found it. I mean, my training is more, I was never taught how to paint. As a young boy with the hippies in Santa Fe, I would go and at night, in fact, painting naked models, they would say, "Who's that young boy? Get him out of the room. He's too young." But that was my only painting experience. But my training is more in drawing. And so with my found papers, I occasionally would do marks on that paper. I like making marks. I like mark making. I like having my presence there. But in the more recent years, I feel that it would create sort of a disingenuousness to the found paper in a Rauschenbergian sense. I wanted the paper to have, or even more maybe like Duchamp, I wanted the integrity of the found um, paper. So when I look for paper, I usually, and if it's movie paper, billboard paper, etc., I found the old original billboard for Woodstock, in fact, and one of the panels was missing, and so they sold me the whole billboard from 1979, minus one panel, and it was just paper. It wasn't on cloth, and it wasn't mounted. But in looking at it, I always turn it to the backside, and I'm hoping for marks, bleeds, a certain degree of transparency, a migration of pigment or ink, because most of them are done lithographically, so it's oil seeping through. So all of that, I find, lends itself to a wonderful sense, especially if it's done on the negative space, and that meaning what I have left unpainted, so it is the ground, but the ground contains that voice, that buried history, that sense of the exotic, that sense of, well, what is that, and how it pertains to, or how it pertains to what I'm doing with the painting, but I think I have an exchange with it, and most of what I paint on my surfaces is truly an exchange, a dialogue to the surface I've created.
Makes a lot of sense.
So an accident lends itself to a dialogue, and or an arrangement of stuff that's unfamiliar lends itself to a compositional answer that then really becomes the painting, or the choice of color, or whether it's curvaceous, curvilinear, or right angled, orthogonal.
And can you talk at all a little bit more about I'm just curious. It made such an impact on me, Robert, when I was here. I think it was one of either the last time or the time before that one. Downstairs, you had a couple of paintings in a room that had, I think, Italian movie posters that you could barely see. Like you talk about the aspect of it being imperceptible, or it being hard to read, or it being, I forgot the word you used, but whatever it was, it made a lot of sense, but it's almost like a kind of ghosting, if that makes sense to you.
Perfect.
Imperceptible kind of ghosting. What was important to you about these particular Italian posters, if you don't mind my asking such a pointed question? What was it about those? I mean, I can understand Nepalese rice papers, that makes a lot of sense, but in your work in general, I don't see a lot of specificity of objects, if that makes sense to you. Does it?
In the collage work?
Yeah. And the Italian posters are quite specific, even though they're hard to read.
Well, I'm going to give you the answer, which is quite specific.
Okay, I love that.
One, I love film, and of course, if an image, or if the name of a film is going to ghost itself into my paintings, I want that film to be a film that, one, I know, or it'd be nice to know it. By chance, I may not, because it is just found paper, although I do go through a selection process. But in this case, a good bit, especially of the Italian films, are films that I do know and I love, whether it's Antonioni or Fellini. Um, in both those cases, I've been very blessed to find posters with their name on it, or whether it's Marcello Mastroianni or even, let me put it this way, Michelangelo Antonioni. You have a lot of consonants there. And so compositionally, you have a lot of diagonal and perpendicular typefaces. And this gets back to specificity. The type is a form of architecture, and I usually like simple, more modern Helvetica-like type and typeface. Helvetica was created in Switzerland in the 50s as a form of neutrality, and one could say even non-gender. I mean, it's a neutral typeface, both figure, ground, etc., as opposed to, let's say, Art Nouveau or something that is very floral. I wanted sort of something neutral and almost very architectonic.
Oh, I love that.
And a lot of my work is architectonic, or compositionally, and it's quite important I say this, laws of gravity works in my painting. They might be two-dimensional, but as you know, I do stack my colors, and the perimeter of the canvases sort of work to make sure that those color bars that now sort of have weight, because I have said gravity, that they can stand up on their own with their own objecthood, have an objecthood, and work almost sculpturally, as opposed to two-dimensional spatiality where things can float and be ungrounded. I would say most of my paintings have to exist within the laws of physics. The painting Guardian to my left here, that's...
Is that Guardian 1 or Guardian 2?
You have Guardian 1, this is Guardian 2. In Guardian, should we talk about that?
Well, here.
I don't know if I answered the first question.
It's fine. But what I want to do now, before we stop talking, I would like you to speak about this painting as it relates to the painting that we have at Savage Wonder. But if I might ask one more, I mean, you're so fascinating, and everything you're saying, I mean, I've never, and it's so interesting because knowing the work a little bit, you know, your words and your meaning is just so palpable and very special because, as you know, I'm a big fan. I do want to ask one last question before you start talking about Guardian, and that is, do you spend specifically a certain amount of time looking for papers or posters? Do you collect them? Is that something you go to flea markets for or travel for? And how important are the papers in selecting them when you use them in the work? Because I know you don't always use them, but when you do, you know, what is your approach to that?
The earliest work, especially when I use memorabilia, and this is work in the 90s, and I think the compositions were done with smaller parcels of paper. Mm-hmm. And they were very endearing because you would find people's names, you would have stamps, you would be transported by the intimacy of what I collaged with. Moving to larger pieces of paper and the work I'm doing now, I don't want, I guess, the sentimentality of the memorabilia to be pretty much part of it. And I think scale-wise, I want the information or the ghosts or the phantoms to be in scale with the overallness of the composition. I think I've simplified or distilled everything in my work in the last 20 years, where complexity to some degree is just complexity, where I find the distilled simplicity and beauty in fewer parts works better to some degree. But I also want to get back to one of the things that's very important about the papers I choose, especially the paper um, that doesn't have anything on it. I've always loved limestone and old stone architecture, and the quality of stone and stone surface. And so that usually would take me back, in this case, through most of my travels to the Romanesque. So we're talking 13, 12 to 1500. And the quality of limestone and even the Louvre in Paris has a quality of limestone where you have this inner light, and this reflective surface of the oceans to some degree. So it is neutral enough where I'm using papers. I have found a paper, it's a French paper that does have the quality of limestone. And so when I just need paper per se and not paper that has a history or this ghost, I tend to use that particular paper that I've collected, and bought as much of that supply as I can. In answer to your question about looking, yes, I look and I have some sources. I let them know when I'm coming. They gather those papers out.
Nice.
Strangely enough, I don't want to look at the front side. I have them turn all the papers over, and I'm only interested in the back side. And this might contradict my answer to whether it's Italian film I like or not. I am really just looking for the quality of the surface and whether that somehow suits, I guess, what I'm after, or what I'm maybe with the sense of preconception of the painting in and of itself, or conception of the painting, what I'm after. But usually I do like some disruption, some engagement, some sense of the past, some burn, some drip, something that will create the dialogue that I mentioned earlier, that I move my puzzle piece in to dialogue with that, and then that begins, this wonderful sort of intuitive set of questions and answers back and forth between me and my material.
Conversation. Yeah. I like the way you talked about the limestone, having a kind of light. And I do feel with a lot of your work that there is an inner light. It's very, very quiet. It whispers, but it's there. And I feel that in almost all of your work, all of your different subjects, compositions, your works on paper, your paintings, they all have a very kind of quiet, very beautiful inner light.
Yeah. One quick thing to answer, though, is that
Yes.
the papers go through this process. It is a wet on wet application, regardless of what papers I use, whether they're historic papers to this French paper I use that is somewhat similar to limestone. But it's important to describe what I do with and through this collaging process. There's numerous glazes on the surface. It is all water-based, so essentially it's an acrylic. The glue itself is acrylic. It's mixed with water. It's much like laying down wallpaper. It has to be wet on wet so I can move it. I usually do an initial lay of paper that might not be the really expensive found paper that I have. It's usually an archival newsprint of some sort. That's done, that's dried, that's gridded, and then I begin the final layer, or the layer that you might see come through in my paintings. Once that is dried, so you're talking about two major surfaces made up of overlapping collaging. So it's pretty densely collaged. But then I have to protect the surface because I'm doing oil painting on top of it. So I do very thin glazes of acrylic on top of that. But one of the things that's, I think, quite fascinating, one of the things I do, and maybe this is what, Da Vinci using sfumata, having that sort of clouded quality that has an aura of it, is that I mix, believe it or not, and cigar ash it's an organic leaf. Once it's burnt, it has a beautiful grayness to it, and if you put it between your fingers, it goes to nothing. So I do mix that. I used to use the ash from my fireplace in New Mexico and grind that down. And mind you, all of this is akin to being charcoal, which is, the basic thing of all things painting or drawing or art. The charcoal.
Back to
That's
Lascaux.
ash. That's wood that's been burnt. So none of this is too weird to say that I'm using something burnt as well. I used to grind charcoal or burnt wood from my fireplace. In this case, a cigar leaf. It's organic. I do I do collect it, not from my own smoking, but from cigar bars that I know. We can edit this out if you want. But I have this very beautiful white cigar ash that's been cleaned and sifted, and I do put that in a binder along with powdered pigments, and I drag that with huge T-squares on my surface, and it pools between the elevation shifts between one piece of paper and the next. And it creates this perfect grayscale of light to dark between those edges, as though it's been shadowed, or I've done a hand shadowing. And it creates like Leger's paintings, or
It sounds like it has almost a vaporous quality to it.
It is vaporous in the sense that the particles go from being few to many, if you want a complete grayscale. But what it does is it creates from a point of view of perception, as well as actually a sense of distance and shadowing, as though light's falling on it and one elevation shadows over the lower elevation. So there's a lot of push-pull between the elevation.
All these paintings you do that with?
Yes. I'll just quickly point this out here. You have a line here, and that line, I can touch my own paintings. That is more measured by the ash in the binder pooling a little bit across here than it is the edge of the paper. This is the real edge. This is the edge sitting underneath this paper. And so that edge is defined by the ash settling there.
Oh my goodness.
So otherwise you wouldn't see it. You wouldn't see this layer upon layer upon layer, because you just wouldn't see it. But with this ash, it gives you a visual reference. But as I said, if you drag a T-square across something, it's going to it'll leave a little bit of residue if on the higher elevation to the lower elevation.
It's like a shadow.
It's like a shadow.
Sfumata.
If that's right.
If that's
So anyway, there's a lot of processes, and of course that's glazed, and then there's oil glazes, and then I can begin to paint. So, God, it's so exhausting.
Well, thank goodness you do it, that you stick with it.